Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of Cherry Chunks, where I'm Cherry and I'm taking up a chunk of your time. Where we last left off, in Witch of the Holy Night, Shojiro's rent was going to be collected by Alice and Alco, and they were fighting over it, and now it's decided that Alco gets 30%, and 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 Alice gets the rest. Apparently the more important thing was supposedly that Alice decided that she wasn't going to kill Shojiro, but I don't think that's really that important. I think it was more important that that they're going to collect rent from him. Anyway, before we begin, remember to like, comment, and subscribe on the video down below so that way I know that you're real. I can know that there are people out there and they're listening. All right, so let's continue on for the next episode. Chapter 8, Are You For Real? Masaki's high school winter vacation began in mid-December. The tranquil air of the school was a refreshing change of pace from the more competitive schools and their nationally famous sports teams and exam-oriented curriculum. The empty, newly constructed building evoked images of a pure white swan descending upon a still water lake. The modern school building felt alive in its stillness in spite of the absence of its lifeblood of students. Most students never knew what this building used to look like. It was just a small, run-down wooden building, a shadow of its former self. The former school was never torn down, and now stood in lonely silence. It was tucked away deep in a seemingly infinite wood that stretched across the mountains. The sound of brooms sweeping dead leaves resonated in the air. The ocean of leaves had accumulated into piles as big as sand dunes. Sweeping was futile venture at this point. An ominous feeling lingered in the air. Perhaps it was a result of 2 years of abandonment. Cleaning the inside of the building alone would take more than a few days to finish. Not to mention...
本当だり、存在価値が見出せねえ。ばっかじゃねえの。冬休みは短いってのになんでこんなことやらせんだよ、生徒会は。
The misguided youth sent here for the job wasted no time making it clear he wanted no part in the beautification efforts.
っていうか、ジャージでやらせんなよ。ジャンパーぐらい着させろよな。何これ、もしかして体育の補習、寒中マラソン。俺体育だけはサボったことねえんすけどね。
Kosuke Kinomi continued to mumble and grumble to himself as he reluctantly swept away at the ground. Meanwhile, Shojiro silently and swiftly continued his sweeping, glaring at Kinomi out of the corner of his eyes.
おい、何真面目にやってんだよ。こんなの適当でいいんだって。だいたい40人しかいねえのにこんな山みたいな庭の掃除なんか終わるかってんだ。
終わらないことなんてない。少しうるさいぞ、木の実は。
Kinomi went back to idly swinging his broom without even glancing at Shojiro. Mornings on the mountain were cold. There was no hint of sun in the cloudy sky above. Ash-gray light illuminated the rear courtyard. The sharp cold of midwinter pierced through everyone's gloves as they did not exist. A day like this was best spent indoors under warm blankets, but for some reason they were out here cleaning. The Special Winter Cleaning Team. That was the name given to the elite force sent up to clean this dilapidated, overgrown mountain. The other students had put their faith into this team to fulfill the beautification mission, respecting them for their sacrifice. The reality, however, that this was nothing more than a ragtag, dare-losing gang of students needing remedial lessons before their exams. They were the victims of a long-term, arm-twisted scheme by the student council. Who in their right mind would come out here to sweep up leaves with a blizzard looming on the horizon? Other than one of the 40 assembled, none of them had any semblance of interest in the task at hand.
おい、見ろよ、しずき。赤羽たち向こうで焼き芋とかレトロな真似してやがる。まあ、2番煎じはいかにも頭悪いしな。そうだ、俺たちはイカでも焼かねえ。
Kinomi did not want to be here to begin with and was constantly trying to break Shojiro into joining him. The cleaning squad was divided into groups. Sojiro and Konomi were in charge of cleaning behind the gymnasium. Sojiro was the leader of the platoon, Konomi was the grunt.
ああ、こことあっちの垣根をきれいにしたら、焼き芋だろうと焼きイカだろうと猫鍋だろうと好きにしよう。
Sojiro said as he expertly packed his swept leaves into trash bags. 2 hours had passed since they assembled in the foggy morning at 7 o'clock. While everyone else chatted and laughed as they worked, Sojiro alone had worked in complete silence at the same blistering pace since he started. The sheer amount of work he put in was likely the only thing keeping him from complaining of the cold in his thin jersey.
なあ、やめようぜ。見ろ、そこの池、スケートリンク。やっぱ池？とにかくそこの池らしきものだってカチカチに凍ってるぐらいなんだぜ。こんな雪原じゃ人体は普通動かねえよ。機械伯爵でもなきゃだよ。そろそろ人間狩りが始まるよ。なんでいい加減休憩しねえ。せっかく枯葉集めたんだから燃やして温まんないとさ。どうせ監視役は殿下しかいないんだしさ。なあ、焼きイカやろうぜ。
For some reason, Konomi was droning on about his squid. Sojiro had managed to withstand the barrage of complaints from his comrade, but even he was reaching his limit.
木の実、頼むから。
Just then, Sojiro saw the Grim Reaper himself creeping behind Konomi. In his hand, he held a rake instead of a soft bamboo broom.
いいぜ。お前がイカなんてもんを用意してるほどの大人物だってんなら、慎んでイカ焼きぐらい許可してやるよ。
Konomi shouted attention to the voice behind him.
その物言い、築地なにがし。
Before quickly turning around, swinging his broom in the process. Tobimaru easily blocked the swing with his rake.
ああ、てめえ、やる気十分じゃねえか。溢れる労働意欲を抑えきれないってわけか。なんならシベリアコースにでも行っちまうか。
女ども集めて焼却炉に陣取ってる野郎の言葉なんざ聞かねえよ。真冬に南国気分とかマジ寒いわ。
Both boys glared at each other with a wry smile, broom and rake locked in an embrace. These two were only friendly with each other on school grounds.
飛び丸、一応彼は戦力なんだから邪魔しないでくれ。
Both of them scoffed angrily and put away their weapons. They both knew better than to argue with Shojiro, the only one cleaning with the garbage bag in hand.
それで何しに来たんだ飛び丸。君はあったかい焼却炉の前で永遠に火の管理をすると豪語していたんじゃなかったっけ。
A harsh comment. Apparently even Shojiro had a slight taste for drama.
なんてこった。善良な生徒ですら俺をそんな目で見るのか。
Tobimaru seemed sad at Shojiro's observation. But as long as Tobimaru continued to claim that he was helping the girls clean by doing nothing more than standing in front of a pile of burning leaves, Shojiro found it hard to sympathize.
いいから要件を言えよ。殿下と違って俺らは暇じゃねえんだ。
ああ、そうかよ。宗次郎、そろそろ小休止だ。向こうで温まろうよ。
お、なんだブレイクかよ。話せるじゃん殿下。
ああ、てめえは除外に決まってんだろ。特権は功労者にのみ与えられるもんだ。焼却炉の前に来たけりゃそれ相応の貢ぎ物を持ってきやがれ。具体的に言うとリアカー1台分のゴミ袋な。
ひっで生徒会応募。
Konomi's complaint naturally fell on deaf ears. Tobimaru had been selected to lead the cleaning operation, and his word was final. If Konomi were to continue to push his buttons, he knew he would be on cleaning duty tomorrow and the next day too.
さあ行くぞ。誰の趣味か知らねえがなぜか汁粉の缶が山ほどあってな。中華まんの一つでもあった方が気が利くってもんなんだがね。あれか、遭難用のチョコレートみたいなもんか。ったくあいつの考えは未だにわかんねえな。
Sojiro reassured Tobimaru by saying but that he thought the food would do just fine for everyone.
なんだよ、行かねえのか宗次郎。
ああ、自分はここに残るよ。旦なら木の実の言うように葉を燃やせばいい。そこに池もある。火の始末なら安心だ。
This was clearly for Konomi's benefit. Tobimaro furrowed his brow while Konomi shivered from the cold.
俺は今友情ってもんを実感している。すげえな。真心って本当にあったんだ。くそ、待ってろしずき。今赤羽たちから芋を奪ってくる。
Perhaps shy to show his true feelings, Konomi ran off to the neighboring group.
な、予想はしてたけどな。ほらよ。
Tobimaro pulled out a hot can from his jersey pocket, scratching his head in exacerbation. He pulled out all three in all, one from each jersey pocket, and one from his pants pocket.
さっさと焚き火の用意をしようぜ。俺もこっちで休むことにするわ。
付き合いがいいのはお互い様だな。
Sojiro quickly prepared the leaves for the fire, carefully gathering them up to burn neatly.
慣れてるな。
マッチがあるから楽なんだ。
Sojiro crouched down in front of the burning leaves and warmed his hands near the flames. Even though he showed no signs of being cold, underneath it all, Shojiro was cold too. He gazed into the fire as the smoke rose from the pile of leaves, as if remembering the good times from his past. Tobimaro felt a touch of concern as he looked at Shojiro. He saw within him homesickness and retrospection. He saw a dark shadow looming over him like a stranger in a foreign land without a home.
元気ねえな、宗次郎。
まあね、少し疲れてる。
悩み事なら相談に乗るぜ。気が向いたら話してくれ。
Tobimaro continued speaking with the pull tab from the can of sweet red bean soup still around his index finger. Sojiro was focused on the fire.
そういえばな、お前が学校休んでる時、青崎に殴られたぜ。なんでも俺は大ボラ吹きだそうだ。
すごいな。大抜擢じゃないか。
Sometimes Sojiro would reply incoherently like this. Tobimaro chalked it up to the cultural differences.
なあ、青崎とはどうなってんだ？テスト前は駅まで一緒に帰ってただろ？うまくいってんのか？あれか。
It was obvious to everyone that this was far from the case, yet Tobimaro asked anyway.
ああ、今は一緒に住んでるよ。
Sojiro went with a truthful, blunt response.
ああ、そうか。一緒と来たか。
Tobimaro tried to laugh it off Shojiro's all too casual confession, however.
一緒に住んでるぞ！
どうした飛び丸？火でも飛んだか？
飛んでねえし、それより怖え。おい、今の聞き捨てならねえたわごとは。
Sojiro protested Tobimaro's reply with silence.
その余裕、マジか。女に興味なさそうな顔してて、やることやってんじゃねえかてめえ。
Tobimaro always felt that he and Shojiro were an equal match strength-wise, but for some reason he could not shake the feeling that Sojiro was now his superior in the brain department. Sojiro cast a rare angry glare at Tobimaro's direction.
こっちこそ聞き捨てならない。なんだ、その女に興味はないってのは。
Sojiro seemed genuinely angry and his voice was icy. The uncharacteristic level of anger from Shojiro was enough to get Tobimaro to back down.
いや、悪い。そんな雰囲気あったんだよ、お前さんは。けどよ、青崎と一緒に住んでるってどういうことだ？いくらなんでも一足飛びすぎだろ。
別に君が期待しているようなことはない。彼女が住んでいるところの部屋を借りることになっただけだ。屋根の裏にある部屋なんだけど、板張りで山小屋を思い出すんで気に入ってる。
Tobimaro did not bat an eyelid at hearing that Sojiro now lived in an attic, and continued his questioning.
屋敷ってあの久遠寺の屋敷か？それこそまさかだぜ。宗十郎、お前一体どんな手品を使いやがった？
飛丸こそあの家を知ってるのか？
そりゃな。これでも築地家期待の跡取り候補だぜ、俺は。久遠寺グループのご令嬢が住んでる屋敷ぐらいは知ってるさ。霊園女学院の2年生だろ、確か。
久遠寺何？
Sojiro was looking more confused than ever, so Tobimaro reluctantly explained as simply as he could that so Sojiro could understand.
クオンジグループつうか財団だな。平たく言えば一族全部がお金持ちで仲良く会社を経営してる連中だと思えばいい。複合企業とまではいかないが輸出業じゃかなりのもんだ。ホームグラウンドは国外で先代の会長の英国びいきがたたって一時期は沈みかけてたんだが5年くらい前かね。本拠地をこっちに移してからはご存知の通りだ。会長が息子に移ってからはきちんと持ち直して今や町の名士だろ。ここでもクオンジの名前はそこかしこで目に入る。
Despite the oversimplified explanation, Shojiro seems to be not getting it. With that, Tobimaro decided to give up trying to explain.
あれだ。想像もできない金持ちってこと。総の字が働いてる喫茶店だってクオンジが向こうから持ってきたブランドだぜ。今じゃ全国チェーンになっちまったがな。
つまりすごく偉いんだね。おかしいな。ならなんであんなに倹約してるんだろう。
Sojiro mumbled incoherently to himself. Tobimaro looked at him with a complex expression on his face, somewhere between envy and a heartfelt
し
sympathy.
かしうまいことやったな。それで本当のところはどうなんだ。男と女が同じ屋根の下にいればやることは一つだろ。
案外古いな、飛丸は。
抜かせ。そのあたりをごまかしてたら男なんざやってらんねえ。
そりゃごもっとも。実を言うと
So Sojiro and Aoko were living together. There were absolutely no chemistry between them. Though that was not to say that living in such close quarters that they did, unintentional mishaps did not occur from time to time. But even still,
驚くぐらいそういうことにはなってない。あの屋敷すごく広いし。
everyone was often busy in their own affairs, so there was no opportunity for that sort of thing to happen.
そもそもだな。もし飛び丸だったら下宿先が同じってことだけで青崎に言い寄る気になるかい？
いやならねえな。
Tomaro nodded intently as if he was thinking back to his many ex-relationships.
いや健全だな。
ああ、健全だろ。
Sojiro gave no more than a quick affirmation to Tobimaro's despondent murmur. He was doing fine. Besides his physical health, it was surely Shojiro's personality that enabled him to maintain any semblance of peace dealing with both Aoko and Alice while living in that mansion.
でもそれとは別の話で青崎には頭が上がらないんだ。彼女にはもう返せない借りがあってさ。
Sojiro's eyes turned slightly serious as he stared into the fire. Tobimaro felt that there was more to those words than what Shojiro was letting on.
もう返せない借りだ。
Sojiro merely nodded in silence in Tobimaro's inquisitive acknowledgement. And just then, a strange scream pierced through the still silence of the woods like a knife.
なんか聞こえたな。
ああ、木の実だ。
Sojiro had already stood up before he responded. He bolted to the frozen pond, broke with the ice with his broom, and scooped up some frigid water in a bucket and threw it on the fire, all in less than 10 seconds. Then he immediately ran off into the depth of the woods where he heard the scream. Tobimaro followed after him in panicked confusion.
飛び丸、この先に何かあるのか？
確か旧校舎が残ってるはずだ。
他には野犬の住処とかそういう嫌な話は？
はあ？いや、いるとしても鹿かウサギじゃねえか。
なら怖がることもないか。急ごうと。
Perhaps because of his time spent growing up the mountains, Sojiro quickly sprinted all over the slippery dead leaves. Tobimaro was not particularly cautious himself, but nevertheless he could not keep up with Shojiro in here. Before long, Shojiro found himself running alone. When foliage blocked the natural trail, he would sometimes clear it away by brute force, but just as often he would expertly weave through the brush. It was clear that he was used to dealing with this level of nature. After a few minutes, Sojiro arrived at the clearing. The wall of trees had ended. It was obviously man-made clearing here on the mountains. In the distance was what looked like an old wooden school building. It was a small, aesthetically pleasing building no larger than an elementary school, lost in the depths of the winter wilderness.
木の実
Kinomi stood alone in the old school grounds.
んなんでしずきまで追いかけてきたん
A sour expression came over Shojiro's face as Kinomi tilted his head in confusion.
そっちこそどうしたんだ変な声上げて。
声いや、そりゃガキ相手に怒鳴ったけどよ。ほら、あのガキだよ。芋持ってるだろ。で、中に逃げ込みやがった。
Kinomi pointed resentfully at the old school building. There was indeed somebody standing at the entrance of the school building just over 300 feet in the distance.
たく、こんな上まで来やがって。いつから子供の遊び場になってんだ、ここ。
Kinomi shrugged his shoulders to signal how little he cared about what the young children did with their time. This place was deep in the woods, but it was not particularly dangerous. Sojiro had run through the woods to get here, but there was also a paved road leading to the spot from outside the woods, too. Kinomi apparently followed that road to get here.
ん子供
Sojiro squinted.
ああ、金髪なんでさっきはちょっと驚いたけどな。外国人の子供ってなんか怖いだろ
It was indeed quite rare to see a foreigner in a provincial town such as Mizaki. Sojiro had never seen a foreigner in person, which made the whole thing even more mysterious.
それで木の実はなんでここまで
いや、赤羽たちがよ、ガキに食料奪われたって言うからここまで追いかけてきたんだ。そういうことだから、二人がかりであのお子様とっちめようぜ。
怖いことを考えるな木の実は。
Sojiro could not find it in him to agree with his plan. It seemed unfair to team up against a little kid.
いいから帰ろう。あの子こっちを睨んでるじゃないか。それに飛び丸にこんなところ見られたら冬休み中ずっと山の掃除で終わることになるぞ。
Sojiro took Kinomi by the shoulders and began leading him back to the path he came from. Kinomi cast one last glance at the old school building before reluctantly following. Just then, Tobimaru appeared panting and out of breath.
早いな、宗次郎。
Tobimaru could hardly catch his breath. He arrived about 3 minutes behind Shojiro despite having a good set of legs on him.
それでどうした木の実、無事か
はあ無事も何も殿下こそどったん
Kinomi seemed perplexed at Tobimaru's first ever display of concern for him.
なんだそりゃ。てめえ、あれだけの大声を上げておいて、しらばっくれる気か上で何かあったんだろうが。
すまない。こっちの早とちりだった。飛び丸は知らないだろうけど、木の実は時々バイト先でも規制を上げる癖があるんだ。
Kinomi looked disapproving at Shojiro's nonchalantly shared of this insight. This was the first he had ever heard of it.
怪しいな。またよからぬことでも企んでるんじゃねえか
ないよ。戻って掃除の続きをするぞ、飛び丸。
Sojiro pat Tobimaru on the shoulder a couple of times and started walking. Tobimaru cast a doubtful glare in his direction and he meandered off. He had a feeling that Sojiro was covering for Kinomi somehow.
まさか、旧校舎に火なんてつけてないだろうな。
誰もしないよ、そんなことは。
Sojiro kept walking and did not look back at Tobimaru as he spoke. Tobimaru and Kinomi tilted their heads in confusion as they reluctantly followed the unusually aggressive Shojiro back to their cleaning spot. And so the special winter cleaning team's activities ended uneventfully. The time was 3 in the afternoon. Upon departing, Kinomi and his crew invited Shojiro to come out to hang out with them, but he declined politely due to his job that evening. He had about 2 hours until his shift began. Not quite enough time to do anything fun, but just enough time to have to fill it with something. Sojiro thought about relaxing in a park somewhere, but quickly changed his mind after remembering how cold it was, even in the city. Not to forget that Elko had handed him those pills in the morning. Elko was absolutely correct in her prediction. Heading back to the mansion now would just be a waste of time. There was no reason for him to return to the mansion until after his shift at work. Still, Sojiro found himself on the way back anyway. Having grown up deep in the mountains, a little 2-hour walk was really no sweat off his back. Mizaki was one of those more quiet residential areas in Mizaki City. The only thing that really stood out here was Shiro Inuzuka. It was a hill that led directly into the woods. Silhouettes of the mountains served as a backdrop to suburbia, silently overshadowing the small human actions of the people who lived there. Even in this modern day of technological prowess, the people here were always careful to pay reverence to the nature around them. If that mansion were a shrine, it would not be a haunted house, but a famous tourist attraction.
というより、今更気づいたけど。
The houses around Shiro and Izuka were all magnificent. Shojiro understood as he looked from the bottom of the hill where the rest of the town lived, at the roof of the mansion tucked away in the woods. He understood what Tobimaro was talking about now that the Kuonji family who owned that mansion might be the richest people in town.
その割に家賃を取るところを見ると、やっぱり嫌われていると見るべきか。
Shojiro began walking towards the mansion with such thoughts simmering in his mind. The feeling of the hard asphalt beneath his feet instead of soft dirt felt lonely and isolating. He walked along the paved road for 10 minutes or so before reaching the iron fence of the woods. Beyond this fence was the private property of the Koenji family. It was bereft of any awkward no trespassing signs. The tall, overbearing iron fence was more than enough to remind visitors that they were unwelcome there. Tojiro casually pushed open the iron gate. Only 2 days had passed since the end of final exams, and he already seemed more than comfortable with the idea of entering the wood alone. The path of the mansion from inside the woods curved and bent like a snake. It took about 15 minutes to reach the mansion on this path. He could have chosen to ignore the long incline and traveled in a straight line through the wood, but he would have expended significantly more energy in doing so. No, using the wooded path was a more sensible option, barring an emergency. Upon entering the foyer, Shotaro heard a conversation coming from the drawing room. It was no doubt Alko and Alice. Shotaro decided to join them. Ever since final exams had ended, Alko and Alice had switched from their daily routine to a more irregular schedule. Alko would disappear into Alice's room in the west wing of the mansion for a while, where she would remain. And Alice would go into Alko's room, not to be seen again. Or they would vanish into the corridors leading around the rear of the mansion, doing who knows what, where Shojiro was most certainly not allowed to enter. Not that he was interested in what they were doing, since Alko and Alice did not seem to want to include him either, serving both parties nicely. For the time being, the Konoji state was pretty peaceful.
ただいま。
Sojiro quietly opened the door to the drawing room. Even though they tried not to be involved in each other's business, Sojiro made it a habit to greet them. The two girls sat across from him on the sofa. On the table in front of them was a large, extravagantly decorated mirror. Alko was dressed for comfort, wearing jeans instead of her usual skirt. In stark contrast, Alice was dressed in her usual all black. Even though break from school was well underway, the witch still insisted on wearing black. As Alko had explained it was probably because it was too much effort for Alice to wear anything else. Sojiro thought that he would like to see her wear something different. Alko and Alice seemed to be in the middle of some sort of dispute. The air in the drawing room was tense. They both ignored his greeting. Alice only briefly looked up at him.
じゃあ、東川の視点は？あそこの柱は白色だし、そう簡単には奪われないでしょ？
ええ。今のところ東川は侵食されていないけど、一つ隣の鈴穂の視点が消された以上、楽観はできないわ。残りの割り出しは今までより早くなる。
そっか。一個釣れれば、あとは芋づる式だもんね。反省したわ。甘く見てたのはこっちの方だった。ここからは1週間単位の攻防になるわね。
The two continued their heated discussion from opposite sides of the table. Ako neglected to even glance up at Shojiro. Shojiro sensed that she wanted to concentrate on the discussion at hand.
でも解せないな。あの夜に人形を出してくるタイミングといい、隠し方だけは一級品なうちの視点を短期間で特定することといい、こいつまず間違いなく市内にアジトを敷いてるわよね。なのになんで結界に異常がないんだろう。三崎市一帯の索敵網はもう100年近く破られたことがないのに。
Alko bit her nails nervously and Alice nodded along. It seemed as though she was wondering the same thing.
母もここの結界には触れなかった。三崎の結界をかいくぐるには、あなたのおじいさんかそれ以上の技量を持つ魔術師でないと難しい。けど それほどの魔術師なら逆に気配は隠しきれない。何か特殊な音響法かもしれないわね。ここ数年新しいサークルの話は聞かないけど。
何？シャーウッドの森？メイキングなら以前アリスの霧が粉砕したじゃない。あれ以上の音響があるっていうの？
例えばの話よ。今回の相手はこちら以上の技量を持っているか、こちらの知らない技術を持っているか。どちらにせよ評価を改めるべきね。私たち気づかないうちに追い詰められているのかも。
The two fell silent. Sojiro, after some internal deliberation, decided to break the silence.
やあ、ただいま。
Alko finally looked up at him in response to his hesitant declaration.
いいからお風呂に入ってきたら？汚れてるわよ、宗十郎。
And with that, Alko turned her gaze to the mirror. Alice briefly looked up at Shojiro again, also before returning her gaze to the mirror. Perhaps feeling at least somewhat satisfied as greeting was acknowledged, Shojiro left the drawing room and closed the door behind him. Alko was right, his clothes were a little soiled.
そうだな。もったいないけど確かに。
Sojiro returned to his room, thinking that a bath might actually feel pretty nice in the cold weather despite not really having broken a sweat at all during the day. He climbed the stairs from the foyer and up the second flight into the attic. Unlike the other rooms in the mansion, this one had no frills to its decor. It was a little cumbersome to use as a living space, but comfortable enough for Shojiro. Everywhere else in the mansion was a little too gaudy for his taste. As far as shelter and a place to sleep went, Shojiro was more than satisfied with his accommodations. There was no electricity in the attic, only the light that which crept from the small skylight. Not that Shojiro minded, he was more accustomed to living without electricity than living with it. With only the faint winter light to guide him, he readied a change of clothes and a towel before heading down to the foyer. Despite the magnificent side of the mansion, there was only one bath in the whole building. And a not particularly large one at that. Whoever the attic was, he or she must not have thought the bath would be so important, or perhaps they were not the bath type. Sojiro descended to the foyer and made his way to the back of the stairs. He knocked at the door to the bath. As expected, there was no answer from the other side. Only the other two occupants of the mansion were still talking in the drawing room. After confirming it was unoccupied, Sojiro quietly entered the bathroom. Even though Sojiro was not aware of it himself, as was common for him, the only hobby he had acquired since coming down from the mountain was taking a nice, relaxing bath. Sojiro had left, but the two girls were still locked in their heated discussion. Needless to say, the topic of their conversation was still that of the outsider mage who had appeared in Misaki City last month. This was, after all, the problem that occurred their time before this whole situation with Sojiro arose, dealing with eliminating the interloper who was set his or her sights on their territory.
今まではおとりにばっかり食いついてたから甘く見てたけど、それも計算づくだったのかしらね。こっちが油断してる隙に本命を一つ奪われた。この相手との戦いはこれからが本番ってことか。
The situation was growing more dire by the day. Until only a couple days ago, the enemy had limited themselves to small skirmishes, but now they'd shifted to full-on offensive. Alko had two major bounded fields she used for defense. One, the larger of the two, was placed around Misaki City to detect magical energy and magecraft. This was used to observe and monitor visitors from outside the city, and it was initially set up by Aozaki's ancestors, the administrators of the territory, and had no way to be removed. The other was set up to energize and manage ley lines from within the territory. The 5 sigils carved into the earth made the standard square-type array, protecting all that lay within its bounds. After some manipulation of the mana flow, the power within was directed and accumulated at the Kononji estate. That is to say, the bounded field existed to monopolize the magical energy within Misaki City. There are 5 sigils in total, with the Kononji estate located in the center. If all 5 sigils were forcibly removed, Alko's jurisdiction over this territory would be in title only. Without the power of the land to back them up, they would be forced to fight back against their invaders on equal ground, with only their own innate abilities to protect them. The only reason Alice and the inexperienced Alko were able to defend this territory so far was because of these two fields. The dragnet that notified Awazaki of any threats was also her lifeline. This time, their enemy had somehow slipped through the cracks and was running rampant. This was what the girls had to face up to.
どちらにせよ時間の問題ね。視点が全て潰されたら、いよいよここでの籠城になるけど。いいの？青子。
ん？別にいいんじゃないの？アリスの言う通り、残りの視点を消されるのは時間の問題なんだし。そりゃ敵のアジトを発見できれば同じだけど、それは絶対必要ってわけでもないでしょ？何より館の守りはあんたがいる限り万全だしね。あっちの方からやってきてくれるなら、それこそ飛んで火にいるよ。他に心配事なんてないでしょ？
そうね。敵が一人だけなら、その時は鏡の範囲をここに集中させて戦場にすればいい。
Alice touched the mirror on the table with her pale fingers. The surface of the mirror rippled like water. The mirror was another protector of Mizaki City, separate from Awazaki's bounded fields. More accurately, it was a ploy that existed only to protect Alice Kanonji rather than Misaki City itself. It generated a thick fog and acted as an invitation to any visitors, drawing them into its board game-like world. Alice referred to it only as the mirror, but it was known to her friends as the Mirror of Slumber. This was the magecraft that Alice Kanonji wielded. Within the rippling surface of the mirror, an image of the castle began to form, and also a lush forest, a field, and a river. Alko stared at the mirror in silence, before suddenly jumping to her feet off the sofa.
そうと決まれば、あとは行動あるのみね。出かけるわよ、アリス。とにかく現場を見ないことには始まらない。
Alice let out a tired sigh in response to Alko's determination, then gave the mirror a gentle caress. The sound of dripping water filled the room. The mirror began to consume the table in a thick fog with a single caress from Alice.
順番に回るのなら、帰るのは朝になるわね。
まあまあ、そう億劫がらないで。ところでアリス、火の五芒星の大挙ってこうだっけ？
Alko traced a shape in the air with her fingers. She mimicked a star shape from the top moving down to the right, from there to the upper left, and so on.
そろそろ壊すこと以外も覚えないとダメよ、青子。
Alice sat up from the sofa, letting out a heavy sigh. They both took their coats from the hangers and left the drawing room.
失礼ね。私だって日々成長してるわよ。この間のおまじないだってちゃんと成功したんだから。
おまじない？
簡単な暗示の呪文。ほら、アリスが教えてくれた軽く弱くうまく早くチクタクチクタク急げや急げってやつ。
それ本当？
ほんともほんと。後で総重量に聞いてみなさい。
Alice swallowed her words, clearly displeased. She likely stopped herself in time to realize it was not worth the effort to take issue with it.
けど、留守中、その彼はどうするの？
大丈夫でしょう。アリスの西館と開かずの間に入らなきゃ即死するようなことは。
Alko responded hastily as she opened the door to the foyer. As soon as she did, just as quickly as Alice's doubts had gotten stuck in her throat, Alko suddenly froze, unable to speak. For a moment, Alko wasn't sure who was standing before her. She could only stare at the glinting rays of sunlight creeping in the room as she reeled from shock. Her mind was completely blank. It was as if she had just woken up from a nap, or a jack-in-the-box had just opened in her face. Choji was probably the only person who truly knew how long the dumbfounded silence went on.
あんた、こんなところで何してるのよ、一体。
Alko had finally found her voice.
何って着替えてるんだけど。
Choji responded as a matter of fact. He offered no explanation why he was changing the foyer and not the bathroom. Alko was too shocked to read him from the riot act. Shojiro was putting a shirt on after presumably just getting out from the bath. His neck was wrapped in bandages and he was completely shirtless. His hair was wet and his skin wasn't glistening from the steam of the hot water. He must have washed himself with nothing more than cold water. Though shocked as to why anyone would do such a thing in this cold weather, she let it slide. The source of her silent stupor was simply his body. Until now, she'd only seen him as harmless without his clothing to hide him. However, he was more fit than she'd ever imagined. For a rough mountain upbringing, where one's body and strength meant survival, perhaps he was even a bit underdeveloped. And on top of that...
それ、傷跡なの?
Alko asked cautiously. Shojiro followed her gaze. He had something that looked like burn scars on his arm. It was a random in appearance, nothing like Alko's magic crest with its ordered patterns.
ああ、これか。ずいぶん前に野犬の群れに襲われて噛みつかれたんだ。命があっただけでも幸運だから、傷跡ぐらいはご愛嬌だ。
A long time ago, he must be talking about when he was a child. Though his life was saved, it was apparent that he hadn't been able to receive proper treatment deep in the mountains where he lived. Those scars were proof of that. Considering what had happened so many years ago, it's likely they would never fade. Only for an instant, Alko thought that wild scars left on his skin suited his lean body perfectly.
確かに、あまり気持ちのいいものじゃないな。自分の部屋で着替えるべきだった。
Shojiro sounded slightly ashamed as he put his shirt on, looking at Alko, standing there in cold silence. The two girls had no response. Shojiro headed for the stairs to go back to his room.
ちょっと待って、宗十郎。
Shojiro stopped and turned around.
なんていうか。
Alko looked away awkwardly, apparently not knowing why she had stopped him herself.
なんか青崎らしくない。さっきから変だけど、熱でもあるんじゃないのか？あれから満足に寝てないだろう、二人とも。
He, of course, was referring to final exams. From Sojiro's perspective, the amount of work that Alko put in seemed strange.
熱なんてないったら。そうじゃなくて、どうしてこんなところで着替えてたのよ、あんたは。
Alko was doing her best to keep up appearances, but for some reason, Shojiro was hesitant to say too much more.
それは、言いづらいんだが、下着の管理はきちんとした方がいいと思う。どっちだかは知らないけど。
Alice, who had been completely silent behind Alko, couldn't resist responding to that statement. Although she hadn't wanted to get involved, this was something she couldn't ignore.
言っておくけど、それは青子だから。
Alice's response was quick and to the point.
洗濯の当番は確かに私だったけど。
Alko seemed like she was just holding him back and ongoing
と
critical.
にかく、もうすぐアルバイトだから着替えてくる。
Sensing that these two were probably about to get into an argument, Shojiro took his chance to leave. And with that, Shojiro briskly left the scene.
アリス。
とりあえず、片付けてくるわ。
Alice calmly walked into the bathroom. A few minutes later, just as the two were about to head out and fulfill their duties as mages, Alko remembered something she wanted to ask.
そうだ、アリス。傷ってあれのこと？
あれは傷跡じゃないわ。だって、あんなにも誇らしいもの。
Alko agreed. What had impressed her was the most about those scars was how he treated them simply as part of his past, absent of any regret. Alko wouldn't have gone so far as to say he was proud, but it seemed like her instincts had been correct. That and one more thing.
でも一つだけはっきりしたわ。それじゃあ、不覚にも見惚れてたのは私一人じゃなかったってことよね、アリス。
Alko smiled rarely at Alice like a child who knew they were doing something they shouldn't with their friend. Alice was trying to ignore her as best she could. She looked away without saying a word. Alko let out a satisfied snicker and began walking towards the front door.
じゃ、行こうか。まずはあの公園からでいいでしょ。今回の件は、あそこから全てが始まったわけだし。
She was talking about the local park in Misaki. The place where they had run into the enemy puppets, of course, where their involvement with Shojiro had all began. Early the next morning, it was 5 o'clock in the morning. Most people were still in their beds sleeping. Although some 24-hour convenience stores had opened last year, Misaki was still very much living the good old days of the early 80s. Even the tofu shop in the shopping district, known for opening earlier than anywhere else, didn't open till 6. But this was the late 80s, during the latter half of Japan's bubble economy. It was a time when metropolitan areas never slept. Those of the countryside, however, remained in the past. The homes were blanketed in silence, the streets were empty of commuters, and not a single automobile could be heard. The sun just barely peeking over the horizon. The town would still be asleep for at least an hour longer before it began waking up. It was during this time that someone stepped out of the Kuronji estate. Sojiro was working the late shift during the winter vacation and had just come home. He moved quietly through the dry room so he wouldn't wake up Aoko and Alice, who were presumably still asleep. The Kuronji estate had a few established rules. One of those rules forbade most Japanese tea. This new rule had only come into effect 3 days prior. It was proposed after Alice saw Sojiro drinking green tea in the kitchen after dinner one night.
Oh?
Looking back on it, the decision had been made rather abruptly. That single gasp of surprise was all Alice said. She grasped her head as if she was battling the most vicious of migraines, called for Aoko, and then made the decision to ban all Japanese teas from the mansion. By some miracle, Aoko managed to negotiate and keep Shojiro's privilege to barley tea during the summer.
だいたいイギリス産だって初めはグリーンティーが主流だったじゃない。
Aoko had clearly hit a nerve with this argument. Aoko stared at Alice, fairly certain why she was so taken aback by Shojiro's actions.
そこまで嫌がらなくてもな。お茶はなんだって美味しいのに。
Sojiro grumbled to himself while sipping his hot green tea. He didn't realize that Alice was upset because he had poured his green tea into a teacup meant for black tea. Sojiro's defense, this was the only teacup that Alice had given him permission to use. At any rate, the early morning was his joy. This was his moment to relax with the green tea that he'd smuggled in. He didn't use this time to read books or watch TV. He just drank his tea and gazed fondly at the garden, or rather, the dense woods outside. Sojiro simply sat, relaxed, and let his mind wander. About an hour passed. Just as he was beginning to feel refreshed, he heard sounds coming from the foyer. He knew it was Aoko and Alice talking, so he rushed to hide his teacup and teapot and tea leaves in the kitchen. Hiding the contraband was easy enough, considering how many unused shelves there were in the kitchen. Shojiro was perturbed by how they wasted the potential of such a splendid kitchen.
あら、早いのね、宗十郎。
Aoko spoke as she took off her white down jacket. Next to her, Alice silently took off her black coat.
いや、今帰ってきたんだ。天城浜の食品工場に深夜のパートで入ることになって。
Sojiro stuck his head out from the kitchen and gestured that he was about to put on some water to boil. Alice tilted her head slightly at him. It wasn't that she thought his gesture was funny or anything like that.
天城浜から。
Alice glanced up the clock in the drawing room and her expression darkened.
どうしたのアリス。
Aoko asked this from her comfortable seat on the sofa.
別に。
Alice responded indifferently before finally sitting down as well.
宗十郎、砂糖は一杯だけだからね。
Aoko yelled at her matter-of-course request into the kitchen. Sojiro didn't respond, but was an affirmative silence. This was a result of 2 entire nights' worth of cramming that Alice knew nothing about.
アリスは？
私はミルクだけでいいけど。
Alice responded out of obligation.
了解、ミルクティーだね。
For some reason, Shojiro dutifully answered Alice's request.
ま、いいけど、いちいち突っ込んでたらキリがないし。それより珍しいじゃない。アリスがティーバッグのお茶飲むなんて。
今日は疲れたから、たまには。
Seems as she allowed herself to accept another's kindness, at least for today.
ま、いいか。それより宗十郎、あんたさっきお菓子のこと言わなかった？
え？別に言ってないぞ、そんなこと。
そう、ならいいんだけど。
The two were conversing over over a distance of 4 yards. Alice decided to add her opinion to the conversation.
しずきくんがおかしなことを言わない日はないと思うわ、私。
Her tone was likely just as low enough that Sojiro couldn't hear it from the kitchen.
そりゃそうだけど、今ちょっと変だったでしょ。いや、何が引っかかったのかまではわからないんだけどさ。
そうね。会話自体は普通だったけれど、内容を考えてみるとどこかおかしいわね。
Ako began gradually more irritated as she failed to grasp what had been odd about the conversation. Just then, Sojiro appeared holding a tray with a teacup for each of them.
何を話してるんだ？単に新しいアルバイトを始めただけだろ。
He put the cups down on the black table without making a slightest sound. Alice couldn't complain about how proper his job as a waiter had made him. While she didn't say anything out loud, she did nod in his direction to show some gratitude. Algo, however,
天城浜だっけ？あそこってスタジアムがあるところでしょ？ツアーの会場になるから時々行くけど。
the student council president, a supposed model student, loved rock bands. Alko was secretly obsessed with a number of bands that used to travel away out of town just to see them perform live when she was in middle school. Of course, this was a world that Sojiro was far from familiar with.
それよりまた新しいバイト始めたんだ。そんなに働いてどうする気なのよ、宗十郎は。
ああ、よく聞いてくれたね。本人の名誉のために名前は伏せるけど、誰かさんと誰かさんが俺の少ない収入を無慈悲に奪っていくから働く先を増やしたんだ。
This was as much resistance as Sojiro was able to give. Alko lifted her teacup to her mouth as she was completely oblivious to Sojiro's monologue.
それは大変ね。
Alice said this as she set her teacup down quietly. There were some things she did not understand. Alko had to hold back her laughter as she looked at Alice and Sojiro.
はあ、言った自分が未熟だった。
Sojiro's shoulders fell as he said this. He took a sip of his black tea, still unsure about the taste.
まあ、アルバイトが多いって分かってくれるだけでいいか。そういったわけだから、冬休み中は夜も留守にする。例の薬はアルバイト先で飲むしかないんだけど。
ああ、それなら心配いらないわ。もうあれはやめたから。いちいち作るのも面倒だし、もっとしずきくんに似合うのを見つけてきたの。
Hako had a huge, ominous grin on her face. She put her hand from her jacket and pulled out a little paper bag. It was a small circular object about 20 inches in diameter, wrapped up nicely like a present.
はい、これは入居祝い。これからはそれをつけておくのよ、宗十郎。
Sojiro opened the paper bag. Inside was a white belt. But it wasn't a belt for putting around your waist to keep your pants up. Put it clearly as possible, it was a collar.
青子。
Alice's expression darkened at the turn of events. But it wasn't clear whether this was friend's insidious or sympathy for Sojiro that concerned her.
どう？気に入った？
Alko was clearly a little crazy. At least she wasn't totally serious. It was obvious that this at least half a prank to see how Sojiro would react. But Sojiro was solemnly considering the collar he had just been gifted.
意味はつかみかねるけど、こういうものを人からもらうのはこれが初めてだ。
He actually sounded like this would be a happy memory for him. Alice narrowed her eyes at what was transpiring.
けど、これは何に使うんだ？
簡単よ。金庫寺と同じで、飼い犬が主人に逆らうと首を絞めるの。あっちは頭につけてたけど、それよりは首のがマシでしょ？
Sojiro grimaced when he finally understood Alko's mean-spirited gift. He really wanted to ask her what kind of person comes up with such an evil idea.
つまり、秘密をばらしたり逆らったりしたら首が締まると。やっぱり熱でもあるんじゃないのか、青崎は。
あら、首輪は嫌？せっかく宗十郎に似合いそうなものを見つけたのに。
Alko, no! Alko still had an evil grin on her face. But Sojiro had a surprising response to this gift that Alko had clearly gotten as a prank.
それもそうか。毎日毒を飲むよりはマシだし、このベルト自体いいものだし。うん、気に入った。ありがとう、青崎。
He spoke 100% truthfully. Aoko's face contorted in disbelief as she could only mumble as if he was serious.
人の行為はどんなものだって嬉しいよ。それにそれが青崎ならなおさらだ。
And with that, Shojiro put the belt around his neck. He placed it over the bandages already
こん
there.
な感じかな。きついけどそのうち慣れるだろう。
Alice is so mad. Despite his words to the contrary, Shojiro tugged the belt comfortably and adjusted it. It was such a perverse scene that Aoko's face was red as a beet, even though it had been her idea. It all been her idea. Perhaps it was because it gave her such a clear reminder of the scars she had seen the day before.
よし。止め方はこれでいいのか。
ね
Aoko retreated guiltily as Shojiro came closer for her to check the fit of his new collar.
黙ってちゃわからないのに。いいよ。アリスに聞くから。
Shojiro shifted his gaze from Aoko to Alice. Alice stared intently at Shojiro wearing his new collar and said,
ロックね。青子、趣味に走りすぎよ。
She could not have put it any more bluntly.
いや、やかましい、そんなんじゃない。もういい、とにかくそういうことよ。これからはその首輪が薬の代わりよ。せいぜい秘密を守ることね。
Aoko was oddly emphatic as she spoke before stomping off towards the hallway.
それと、これからお昼まで仮眠を取るけど、くだらないことで起こしたら殺すから。
Aoko slammed the door behind her as she left the drawing room. Shojiro stared in amazement.
なんで青崎はいつもいきなり怒るんだろ
He murmured to himself, forgetting that Alice was standing right there in front of him.
しずきくんには悪意が通じないからでしょう。気にする必要はないわ。
う。悪意って今のが
Alice looked up at Shojiro's innocent response. There was a glimmer in her eyes that showed surprise at her current actions.
なんでもないから気にしないで。
With that terse reply, she returned to her usual expressionless self. There was no use explaining Aoko's feelings. Aoko bought that collar for the sole purpose of annoying Shojiro and causing mischief. When things didn't turn out how she planned, her conscience got the better of her. Shojiro mistakenly thought that Aoko was angry at him, when in reality she was only angry at herself. Alice didn't bother telling Shojiro all these heartwarming details, though. Not because it was too much work, just because that she was never one to have meaningless conversation. That was how she had been raised.
しずきくんはこれからどうするの？
Alice suddenly changed the topic. Shojiro thought for a while before replying.
夕方までゆっくりするよ。ここのところ忙しすぎた。せっかくだからテレビも見ていたいし、お昼には青崎を起こさないといけないだろ。
そう。なら静かにしていて。
Alice let out a gentle sigh and rose to her feet. Just keep it quiet. Shojiro would understand exactly what she meant by those words in just a few minutes. The sun shining through the window was bright. It was just about 9 o'clock, about the time for morning television programs to get going. Shojiro was sitting on the sofa staring out the window at the scene outside. The view from the neighboring sunroom showed a courtyard in a state of disrepair. Shojiro could appreciate the outdoors in both its natural wild state and when tamed by human hands.
あれは近いうちに何とかせねばなるまい。
Shojiro muttered to himself, turning another page in his textbook. On the table before him was a mathematics textbook and a notebook with Aoko's name on it. Although at first glance he appeared to be diligently a student studying on his day off, he was in truth only doing so as a compromise. He had given up on his main intent of watching the morning television shows. The reason why he gave up was simple. He was being considerate of Alice, who sat in front of him with her nose buried in a book. Instead of holding herself up in the room, she brought out her old dusty books to read. This is what she meant by when she had said to keep it quiet. Shojiro found it difficult to turn on the TV.
とりあえずしばらくテレビは控えよう。
With that decided, Shojiro resigned himself to reviewing some of the practice problems he'd gotten wrong. In the drawing room, for some reason, There wasn't any particular purpose in doing it here, but he also had no reason to study back up in his room. And so there he was, leisurely highlighting his textbook with Alice there in the same room. To Shojiro, there was really no difference between his room in the attic and the drawing room with Alice. To be fair, he could probably live with a tiger as long as it didn't cause any trouble. That was both Shojiro's biggest strength and his biggest weakness. Before he knew it, the clock was showing 11. He spent 2 hours doing his math problems, but they wasn't even halfway finished. More than that, he was disappointed in himself for lacking the courage to speak up at all.
それに比べて青崎は頑張ってる。
He dropped his mechanical pencil on the notebook and watched it roll away. He knew that Alco and Alice were busy for something since final exams had ended. He also knew that she had hardly gotten any sleep recently. If she had been able to ignore him during exams, then she probably would have used her time. Today's nap was probably the first proper sleep Alco had gotten in days. But she showed no signs of exhaustion despite the fact that she must have hit peak long ago. She always seemed raring to go. It wasn't that she was trying to act tough. That was just the kind of person she was, always positive, always tough as nails. And that was exactly why she came off completely irrational at times. But if that was the case, you could probably describe Alice as exactly the same way. Shojiro couldn't help but feel inadequate when he saw their single-minded focus on their goals. He was been so preoccupied with adjusting to his new life that he neglected to think about what he was going to do with himself after. Thinking about this cast a gloomy cloud over his heart. He felt like he'd never find a clear purpose in life like Alco and Alice seemed to have. At least not since he'd left the mountains. His whole life was gone now, never to return. It was like a kite cut from its strings, destined to fly out where the winds took it. Without anything to ground him, he couldn't do anything about the empty future that lay ahead. He could only let himself fly where the currents took him, slowly losing sight of the ground below.
そうだな。便利なものは溢れているけど、本当に望むものは。
This town was full of options, but he could find nothing. He'd asked himself the same questions time and time again. It never made him feel any better. If anything, it only made him feel worse and worse. That, or maybe he felt that lamenting his own ineptitude would lead to finding some kind of goal or desire someday. Tired of his own sniveling, Shojiro dejectedly closed his notebook. When he looked up, he saw his own face reflected back at him in the TV screen. His new collar was there around his neck, looking out of place as ever. Perhaps a fool like him, who even felt weak when faced with other strengths, who did need to wear a collar after all.
まったくだ。悩むのは一丁前になってから。
He shook off his thoughts of doom and gloom and sat up straight. After psyching himself up a bit, he stood up from the sofa.
よし。何か作るけど、アリスは？
Shojiro asked casually. While Shojiro had been doing his own thing, he had remained mindful of Alice. Alice looked up surprised at hearing her name. She had completely forgotten Shojiro was even there.
私？
ああ。アリス、朝から紅茶しか飲んでないだろ。どうせ作るならいっぱい作った方がお得なんだ。
Without waiting for her reply, Shojiro headed off to the kitchen while putting on his apron. Alice tried to wave at him to stop, but then he'd already disappeared into the kitchen. She was hesitant to walk all the way there just to tell him she didn't need anything. And besides, she was actually hungry. Shojiro's proposal made sense, and her empty stomach agreed. Alice was hungry, and Shojiro was going to make lunch. Making lunch for both of them would save them time and trouble cooking for 2 separate meals. There was no logical reason for Alice to refuse his gesture. She decided to stay quiet and tactically accept his offer.
変な人。
She whispered the words softly, not for anyone particular to hear her by herself. The truth was, however, Alice had been in a bad mood all morning. After checking all the sigils around Misaki City and boarding the first train back to Tokawa, all she wanted to do was spend the rest of her day reading until the words turned into a jumble. Her iron resolve to complete this task would not be interrupted by anyone else smiling about in the drawing room. This was her mansion, and there was no way she was going to lock herself up in her room and account to Shojiro. However, that said, she knew it would be wrong to kick Shojiro out for no real reason. As it stood, Shojiro actually kept quiet like she'd asked. He wasn't in the wrong here. If Alice had really wanted to be alone, she would have gone to her room.
静かにしてじゃなくて一人にさせてと言うべきだった
Alice had defiantly stayed in the drawing room despite realizing the dilemma she'd put herself in. She had figured Shojiro would eventually make a ruckus and run off to hide in his attic room. Her assumption could not have been any more wrong. Shojiro never left the drawing room. Moreover, she had actually stopped caring that he was there. Though he hadn't paid her any attention, he hadn't ignored her either. They had simply sat in silence together without any awkwardness. Alice felt the freedom of being alone along with the comfort of someone being by her side. To put it into words, Shojiro was just that kind of person. That was probably the only reason Alice had been able to sleep so soundly with him there next to her. Shojiro continued cooking in the kitchen, oblivious to the thoughts that went through Alice's head. She couldn't see him from the drawing room, but she could easily imagine him cooking in the kitchen.
変な人ね
Alice resumed reading after unwittingly stating her feelings out loud a second time. Sunlight gleamed through the drawing room showed that it was noon. The sunlight actually looked warm despite it being a cloudy winter day. Just as noon struck, Shojiro turned to the drawing room with 2 sets of plates. Some food was an indescribable color was piled to the large cream-colored plates.
これは
She hadn't expected this much. She hadn't expected much, and since she hadn't requested anything, she could just refuse it. This wasn't something she didn't want, but this food left her at a loss for words despite psyching herself up.
これは何
Alice spoke as though she was terrified of what had been placed before her.
何って焼きうどんに何かかけてみた
Oh no! Is Shojiro a disaster chef? If Alco had been there, she probably would have punched him. But Shojiro confidently placed 2 large plates on the table. Steam billowed from a mountain of food like an angry volcano ready to erupt any moment. The thick mystery sauce flowed between the plates of magma might be said eruption. And below it all were a seemingly infinite number of slimy tentacle-like noodles. This was really nothing more to say about it. This was clearly the food of a poor, struggling student who favored quantity over quality. All that was required was a basic recipe, the will to cook, and something the few ingredients were needed. The pile of stir-fried noodles and sauce slathered on top was so horrifically bad it was almost an art form. This was a bachelor's cooking if she'd ever seen it. There was really nothing else you could call it. She had wondered what he was doing for an hour in there, but it turned out that he was making this sauce. No sauce would have been fine, but Shojiro had wholeheartedly gone the extra mile. Shojiro bowed his head slightly and picking up his chopsticks. He had brought a fork for Alice. She picked up the fork and stuck it into the noodles, half drowning in sauce. Shojiro began eating, not seeming to care. Alice sat there looking like she was going to eat poison. She seeming to view this as a challenge, Alice throwed her bound and slowly brought the massive noodles to her mouth. Does it look bad but taste good? It was a little salty and ugly to look at, but it didn't taste all that bad. If anything, it was actually pretty good. Looks bad,
一
tastes
つ
good.
聞きたいんだけど
Shojiro put down his chopsticks and turned to speak to
実際
Alice.
の話魔術師の話はともかくとして青崎はまだ誰にも手を出してないんじゃないか
Alice looked up quietly at the sudden question. She had been inspecting Shojiro's meal, but now she looked straight at him.
おかしなことを聞くのね静木くんは
アリスには悪いけどこれは青崎本人には聞きようのないことだから言いたくなければ答えないでくれ
Alice didn't respond. Shojiro resumed eating, not seeming disappointed. Alice stared blankly at him, slurping his noodles. After much hesitation, she replied,
静木くんの言う通り青子はまだ人を殺したことはないわその行為自体は何回かこなしてはいるけれど
Alice responded with a slow and measured. Shojiro still looked troubled, but not at the conversation that they were having. Rather, he looked apologetic towards Alice. He said she didn't have to answer anything if she didn't want to, but Alice kept talking despite the face he was making.
静木くんが見た公園での出来事が 青子にとって初めての殺人行為を。
Sojiro silently nodded. Alice narrowed her eyes at him suspiciously.
まるで初めから分かっていた素振りね。
そうじゃな。いや、そうなのかな。たまにその手のセリフを言うけど、何か違う気がしたんだ。だから多分、青崎はまだ人殺しというのを体験していないんじゃないかって。でもまあ、そんなことよりもっと確かなのは、
しずきくんが今生きているということね。
Sojiro chuckled at Alice's stellar response. Exactly. Things would have been more clear-cut that night if Alco actually killed someone before. Sojiro would have been dead before he even saw her face. For better or for worse, Alco remained inexperienced in spite of her ruthless and decisiveness. Sojiro relaxed his shoulders. His stern face gradually returned to its normal carefree state. Then...
でもそんなことは関係ないわ。あの子はそのあたりが異常だから。行為は理性に、経験は知識でたやすく補ってしまう。そうね。青子はその気になれば迷うことなく人の命に手を出せる。
And with that, Alice went back to twirling her noodles around the fort. She looked like she's having fun, Shojiro thought as he ruminated over what she just said. She was rational enough to accept herself despite acting against society's morals, and possesses an intellect that exceeded even the confidence gained through experience. Had Alco been raised to utilize her logic and reason to forge reality from fiction? If that was the case, then perhaps they really were different from Shojiro.
すまない。こんなことを聞いたのは、青崎には内緒にしておいてくれないか。
Sojiro seemed serious as if he really regretted asking. Alice's expression remained unchanged, but she had never intended on saying anything to Alco anyway.
ありがとう。なんだか、アリスには内緒話ばかり溜まっていくね。
Sojiro went back to eating his food. Though Alice had still only a single bite, she was already Even though Alice had only had a single bite, he was already scraping his clean.
そういえば青崎にも聞いたんだけど、アリスと青崎はいつもああなのか？
Sojiro had suddenly decided to change his topic of conversation. His new topic was rather cold and dry relationship between Alco and Alice. Alco said the relationship was normal, but maybe Alice had a different opinion.
会話が少ないことを言っているのならそうなるわ。けど別に不便じゃないから。
Alice was still twirling her noodles with her fork as she gave her a concise answer. Around and around the noodles went, but none made it to her mouth.
不便じゃないって、そういうの仲がいいって言わないんじゃないのか。
私と青子の仲が良くないとしずきくんは困るの？
Sojiro swallowed his word at Alice's perplexed reply. It would actually, but he wasn't sure how to respond to it when asked directly.
いや、なんかこっちの考え方が悪かったみたいだ。もうその話題には触れないことにしたから忘れてくれ。それより、アリス。
Sojiro gave Alice a piercing stare that was more intense than any time they'd talked before. Alice was tightly taken aback by the unusually intense look in his eyes. Her face began silently flushed out of nervousness. Nobody besides Alco ever stared at her like this before. Whether or not he had noticed, Sojiro waited a few moments before speaking slowly with complete conviction.
それ、食べないなら欲しいんだけど。
An awkward silence followed.
悪いけどこれ私のだから。
Suzuki had cooked it, sure, but Alice wasn't wrong. He had made it for her after all. There was a single tinge of anger in her voice, but she wasn't sure why it was there.
そうだね。少し意地汚かった。
Sojiro plopped himself down on the sofa. This must have looked particularly pathetic to Alice, and she responded with,
その材料はもう残ってないの？
She quickly covered her mouth. Apparently, she was surprised even herself. It was quite unusual for her to ask for something like
残っ
that.
てないよ。青崎の分も作っちゃったから。
Sojiro stared a bit regretfully at Alice's plate as he responded, Alice could have just let it go, but for some reason she felt the need to speak up again.
青子なら眠っているけど。
いや、もうすぐ起こすから。起きた後で作らされるより一緒に作っておいた方が楽だしね。と、もうすぐ1時か。ちょうどいい。行って起こしてくるよ。
青子は起こしたら殺すって言ってたけど。
Alice wasn't sure why Shojiro was willing to take such a risk. Shojiro agreed, but started walking away.
でもさ、今起こしておかないとやっぱり後で殺される運命にあると思うんだ。
His words were surprisingly affectionate. Leaving Alice with only that, Shojiro headed to Aoko's room. Alice watched him leave in silence before taking another bite of the stir-fried noodles. Glancing at the door in the hallway to make sure nobody else was coming, she took another bite. She repeated that process many times before finishing her food. It was then that she heard Aoko's wrath coming from the second floor. Alice stood up and began solemnly clearing the table, feeling a bit sorry for Shojiro was dealing with. She knew she didn't really have to, but it felt like it was the least she could do for him. She never really expected to feel this way. But he'd cook for her, and it was surprisingly good, almost enough to make her forget how bad he was at making tea. There it is, guys. There it was, another chapter completed. And we shall continue on to the next time. Remember to be good to everybody. And also something. I don't know what's gonna happen. Alright, bye-bye guys. See you next time. Bye.